Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webcast today. We've assembled an excellent panel that brings a great deal of knowledge and firsthand experience to defensible deletion. So let me go ahead and introduce everyone. Julia Brickle is Executive Managing Director and General Counsel at H5, which applies search and measurement expertise and technology to address data management, compliance, and e-discovery. Julie is a former litigator at Davis, Polk & Wardwell and a former Deputy General Counsel of Philip Morris USA. Julie speaks often on matters related to information governance and e-discovery. Connor Crowley is the principal of Crowley Law Office. He's the chair of the Sedona Conference Working Group on Electronic Documentation, Document Retention, and Production. And he's also the editor-in-chief of the Sedona Conference Commentary on Information Governance. And Connor advises law firms and corporations on all aspects of information governance. James Wolfe is the Senior Technical Director at H5. James has been with H5 since 2001, leading the H5's product development, IT, and technical operations teams at various times. James has been in the software and data analytics space since the early 90s, developing products for Oracle and Xerox and other various startup companies. Most recently, James has been providing consulting and expertise to H5's clients in the area of information and records management, e-discovery, and information governance. And my name is Robert Fowler. I'm the Director of Professional Services at Jordan Lawrence. Jordan Lawrence is a longtime ACC Alliance partner, and for the last 26 years, we've helped companies develop, implement, and enforce corporate records programs. For the last 10 years, I've worked with clients of all shapes and sizes, helping them to defensively downsize their data. So we have a lot to cover in 1 hour, and we will try to answer some questions at the end. If you do have questions, you can submit them on the right-hand side in the question section during the session. And if we don't get to your questions, we will definitely follow up with you after the webcast individually. So, there's many aspects of data management within a company, and today we're going to talk through the process of getting to defensible deletion of unneeded data. So today we're going to address the needed buy-in, how to determine what you need to keep. We're going to talk about implementation and also including, where warranted, the use of automation, validation, as well as documentation. So there's overwhelming agreement from general counsel, CIOs, litigators, analysts, bar associations, and even technology and e-discovery experts on the tremendous value of defensible deletion. So to get things started today, I'm going to start by asking Julia and Connor a question. And that question is, why isn't every company defensively deleting legacy and redundant information?
That's a great question, of course. We all know that corporate data is being created at record speed, in record volumes, and in more and more disparate locations. The data needs to be stored, backed up, secured, retained where warranted, and ultimately disposed of properly. Yet the disposal step really stymies many companies. So what are the barriers? So first, data is essentially invisible outside of IT. So one step is you need to be able to show how much data there is and how spread out it is within the company. So I've used a technique once very successfully of taking a 11 by 17 booklet, maybe 20 pages long, full of icons of each data system and source in a company, excluding legacy media that's lying around the company. Each icon about the size of half of my pinky nail, and taking it to high-level people who needed to buy in and said, that email system you know about, that's this icon on page 4, and all the rest of these sources exist, and we need to manage them, that they're outside your knowledge, essentially. Right? Very effective, because people think they know what exists, and in fact they don't. So next problem, disparate ownership. IT traditionally owns the data, although that's less and less true now, but it doesn't own responsibility for managing it, the authority to manage it, the budget to manage it, and it doesn't have knowledge of the content that's needed to manage it. So what you really need is a team across IT, legal, record management, compliance, with business involvement from each department to get this problem addressed. And of course, those teams don't speak the same language. So you've got to think about what's a process to get those teams to think they're a team. Weekly meetings across, years is kind of the way I think about that. You need high-level champions. So high-level folks who will stand strong when it's time to decide to delete, who are going to help find the budgets, because it's often a high-level issue to get the kind of budgets you need, and people who will symbolize the importance of the issue for the employees. You need to be a story of what's the payoff. ROI is hard to measure because often it's based on avoidance of risk and costs, but you need a convincing story about the payoff or you're not going to get this off the ground. And we'll talk more about that. Budget, I mentioned it briefly. Nobody wants it in his or her budget. But this is a company issue, not a department issue. It's again where your high-level champions come in. You need to get a budget that is not coming out of any one department. And then finally, I think expertise. Clearly, with the volumes we have, employees do not have the time to manage all the data that's being created and received in a company. And so you need to be able to harness both good ideas and often technology to help you where manual processes aren't feasible anymore. So you need to link business energy with the appropriate expertise. Connor, you advise a lot of clients. How do you get the ROI story put together in a way that the business will jump in and start this process?
Well, that can be really quite difficult at times, Julie, because this is truly discretionary spending. This is not e-discovery, where you have a litigation gun to your head and you must undertake the tasks required to comply with your preservation, review, collection, production obligations. This is purely discretionary. And often what I hear from clients is that this problem is already so large that it's intractable, it's unmanageable. To which my response is, quite frankly, the problem isn't going away. And the problem is only going to get larger the longer we wait, because information continues to be created, it continues to accumulate, and the volumes just keep increasing. What I like to do is start with a discrete project. It could be simply one type of media, one source of information, one department, and bite off that little chunk. Undertake the efforts necessary to delete information that's not subject to retention because there's no legal, business, or regulatory need to keep it, and then demonstrate how deleting that information has dramatically reduced the costs attendant with managing that information and also many of the risks. Now, we can actually quantify those risks if we want to. We know the probability of somebody being sued. We know the potential costs involved, and we can come up with a rough calculation of the monetary risk we're actually avoiding. But the key is break this down all chunks so that we can be step by step to whittle away at it.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit more about the risks, since we know they have anticipated costs. What are the high-level risks that the audience might consider when it's trying to create a successful return on investment discussion with people in the company?
Well, I think first and most obviously for people is the e-discovery costs and risks that are associated with having to preserve, collect, review, and produce information that shouldn't perhaps have been retained to begin with because its retention period has expired. You're going to have to deal with managing all of the unnecessarily retained information anytime you get into litigation. And there's a real cost to that, which we'll discuss in just a minute. There's also risks attendant with respect to data privacy. We've all heard the stories over the past year of data breaches, the unwarranted disclosure of information, companies being hacked, there's going to be reputational harm that ensues when the information that the company has been trusted to hold is actually hacked and disclosed. There's going to be out-of-pocket costs to mitigate the damage, whether it be by fines and penalties or breach notifications. And this is a problem that's getting worse and worse as the number of data sources continues to increase with bring your own device, movement to the cloud, etc., etc. Now, with respect to global companies, Julie, this is really getting to be more and more of a problem as well.
And would you explain that?
Sure. The privacy scheme in the U.S. is really, to a large extent, still based upon various industry sectors, be it finance, be it medical, whereas in many other countries, it is based upon personally identifiable information, which is a term that is incredibly broadly defined. As you lose control of your information by putting it into the cloud, and you're not sure, in many cases, where that information resides anymore, you may be inadvertently triggering privacy regulations in jurisdictions in which you don't do business simply because you have inadvertently moved information there. You are also dealing with, as the amount of information and the number of sources continues to increase, increased costs and complexity for IT, who have to try to get a handle on all this different information and manage it and make it available to the business units so they can actually do their jobs.
Thank you. I can't tell. Is this telling a story on the e-discovery cost side? I've litigated cases where back in the paper days, all the boxes, and there were probably 100 boxes that came out of the warehouse, had bright orange stickers on them that said dispose after year 3. And our litigation was brought in year 10. And so the entire case was based on, the discovery in the entire case was based on documents that the company had no reason to keep, but had failed to pull back out of the warehouse. Huge costs.
And I think that problem is even worse now because there aren't any orange stickers on the boxes anymore. There's nothing screaming at us, this information should be deleted. There was an interesting study a number of years ago now, but I think it's still highly relevant. After a large complex piece of litigation, DuPont went back and they looked at all the information that they preserved, collected, reviewed, and produced. And they found that a staggering 40% of that information shouldn't have been reviewed, produced, preserved. It shouldn't even have existed because its retention period had expired prior to the preservation obligation being triggered. So that was a full 40% of those costs that could have been avoided if the information had been defensibly deleted at the appropriate time.
So let's talk some more about data sources. We've mentioned them. The data is obviously, well, obvious to me. Data is everywhere. Companies don't always understand that. You know, the average CIO stays at one job for about 3 years, and when the CIO walks into the new job, the first question the CIO asks, I guarantee, is not, where's the old data that nobody's using anymore? And where are your old legacy systems? They don't ask that question, so in fact, IT as a system doesn't actually know where most of the data is. Now, to find sources, there are different ways to go about it. You can survey the world, walk the floors, get the maps from IT, interview people, and we'll talk more about that. Or you can pick a source to start with, like Connor, like you mentioned, and go from there and let the energy that gives you help lead the company to find the rest of its information. I usually think about prioritizing the non-custodian data sources first, because if you get hit with litigation, you can find the things that a particular business person owns and uses and knows about. It's everything else, to me, that's the risk, where you risk the unknown mistake in litigation. But each business is different and would need to make its own decision. What do you advise usually?
Well, I think you raise a great point there. I mean, you need to pick a discrete source to start with. We have entered into a tremendously complex era where we not only have tremendous amounts of non-custodian data, but we have a tremendous new variety of sources of information and repositories of information, oftentimes through what has been termed in the past credit card IT, where an employee will bring in an additional piece of software or an additional device, thereby adding to the complexity of the IT infrastructure that's actually going to have to be dealt with down the road. So very, very key here, pick a small, discrete target to start with, build upon your success there, and use that to evangelize this throughout the rest of the organization.
Right. And I will offer a question that I've found useful for high-level folks who aren't really that interested in this project, which is to explain that courts expect a company to know where its information is. It certainly knows for business purposes, and therefore the company should, in the judge's mind, know for the court. And so I found it effective to say to a CIO or other high-level person, before you have to come to court and explain our data systems and where all our corporate data is there anything we can do to help you? So we make sure we know where it all is. And that personal stake has been quite motivating for folks, I find.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, because the days when courts were willing to accept that computing and IT was so complex that no company could get a handle on their information, those days are gone, I think, in many courts, and will be gone over the next couple of years in other courts for large organizations in complex litigation.
Right. So let's move forward. Robert, if you want to flip the slide. One of the things that's very important to recognize is that defensible deletion is about retention of what you need to keep and secure disposal of what you don't. We tend to talk in terms of defensible deletion, but really the nagging problem we're trying to solve is making sure we've retained what we need to retain so that we can get rid of the rest. So today we're going to talk a lot about retention and how to find what you need to retain, because once you've found that, you'll be able to dispose of the rest defensibly. Connor, you on board with that?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, because what we're really trying to do here is ensure that we're satisfying our business, legal, and regulatory needs to retain certain types of information. That's one bucket. The other bucket is all the other information that there is no business, legal, or regulatory need to retain. That information you can dispose of in a secure, defensible fashion and take that off the table. But you're right, it's really a retention problem. How do I ensure that my system that is designed to retain the information that I'm required to retain is only retaining that information? That's a great place to start.
So let's walk through the key elements of the retention problem. How do you determine what you need to keep? Connor?
I think there's a variety of ways. Generally, it's going to, you're going to start with what are the regulations I'm subject to, what are the needs of the business unit, and what are the exceptions to my normal retention process. And that's going to be your legal holes or your regulatory holes if, for example, there's a government investigation. You're going to want to get a high-level view of what is the information I'm supposed to keep. You're going to then identify departments and sources where information may already reside, because there is an obligation to properly retain that information, for example, pursuant to SOX compliance. Your records retention schedule is going to be very helpful here. In the past, what we have seen is organizations had very large, complex retention schedules. They might have had 30,000 separately defined records, each with its own record retention period. What that often resulted in is everybody who was forced to operate within that schedule classifying things as other. It really wasn't advancing the ball. What we have seen in recent years is a move away from that level of detail and granularity into a big bucket approach, where I define large categories of records that would encompass many of the ones that were previously discretely identified, and pick a small number of retention periods. It could be 1 year, 5 years, 7 years, and permanent, but it's a much smaller category and number of retention periods that are going to have to be dealt with. This makes compliance much easier for custodians because there's only a few categories they have to look at, and is going to make figuring out what you have that you need to keep and what you have that you don't need to keep much easier as you go forward in that approach. Important, of course, to keep that current, keep it updated. And one of the things I found extremely helpful with clients is, instead of simply defining what is a record, also provide a list of things that are not records, so people have clear, concise examples they can turn to, and keep updating that as data sources and types of information change to provide that clear, practical guidance to people.
Thank you. Now, Robert, Jordan Lawrence obviously guides companies through the process of creating and updating record retention policies that reflect what the company either needs to keep or wants to keep. Can you give us a practical view of that process from your perspective?
Absolutely. So, the very first step is to develop a records inventory, and that's going to allow you to really get a handle on your records and information and what you have. So the records inventory tells you what records your company creates and what your business people call them, which is really important. I've personally been involved with these kinds of initiatives over 300 times, and I've never found any uniformity in existing policies and what business people call their records. So this process enables companies to establish uniform standards that work across the business, common naming conventions, so that everyone's calling their records the same thing. You also need to understand where your records exist throughout the company, and this can include things like different lines of business, different regions, different functions or departments. Also, we need to understand not only where they're located from a departmental perspective, but what media do they live on? What applications do they exist in? Are we keeping records in email? And, are employees saving those emails, outside of the central messaging environment? So what you need to understand are the areas that should have access to certain records and information, and what areas don't need access to them. You also need to understand the processes in which records are produced, how they're stored, and how your business people share them throughout the business. And certainly, and quite obviously, I think we need to know how long are we supposed to keep our records. And understanding the legal requirements is just as important as understanding the real business reference value of information. So when I say business reference value, what we're saying is, how long does an employee need a record to do his or her job? And it's important to understand the regulatory requirements, but also how long do our business folks use their records. And finally, you have to understand these special characteristics of your records and information, particularly what makes them sensitive. And this includes, intellectual property that obviously you want to protect, and in many instances, it's your customers' data. And so I can tell you that technology is really good, if you're looking for a credit card number or a social security number. But oftentimes there's a shortfall when you're looking for things like corporate proprietary information, for instance. So this collection of information is a records inventory, and it enables you to point to a good faith process that you went through to develop your deletion policies. And it's key to making those policies actionable. And most importantly, they're going to work for the business, they're going to work for legal. IT is going to be able to support them and take action, and it's going to make a lot of sense to your business people as well. So let me walk you through this process. To create a records inventory, a company needs to look inside the business practices and talk to employees. So we need to understand our records and information and the value they provide to the business. And what we have found is that the business people are really the ones who know what records they have, they know where they store them, they know, what media they keep them in, and generally how long they're retaining them or need to reference them. And we've also found that business people naturally tend to think about their records as opposed to documents or data. So the record types are very familiar to them. So the approach we use is to prompt business people with the records that they commonly use in their departments and make sure that there's good descriptions as to, you know, what's defining these records, but we're not creating an exhaustive list of individual documents, very similar to what Connor had mentioned earlier. We're not looking to create a records retention schedule with 30,000 line items on it. It doesn't work. No one's going to be able to utilize that. So we're not looking to talk to everyone here when you go through a process like this. So 1 or 2 individuals is generally just perfect from each department, and we're looking for folks that, you know, work with the records on a day in, day out basis, and they're going to be the ones that can give us the information that we need. So for each record the business person identifies, we can then map the where based on their department. And from there, we need to understand how business people use their records and the flow of information. So again, where are they saving them? With who or how are they sharing their records? What applications are they keeping them in, or do they pull records out of? You know, what are they keeping in email, shared drives, other locations? It's all essential to understanding business practices and uncovering and addressing all the redundancy that exists within departments, as well as across the entire organization. And also highlighting, here are the people that should have access to these records, and here are the folks that don't need access. So in addition to, you know, talking to your business people, which is critical, it's also very, very important that we have these conversations with our IT group as well. And those are designed to really understand the infrastructure. So things like, how does our email system work? What do our backup practices look like? Again, what applications are we using? Are they hosted by a third party? Talking with your file server administrator. And of course, I mean, we can't forget good old-fashioned paper records. And what we've found through the years is organizations have lots of boxes of paper records, either stored in on-site facilities, off-site facilities, but we need to take those into consideration as well. So from there, we can identify these specific attributes and these special characteristics about each department's records. So this is going to include how long and why our business people need records and information to support their area or to support their business function. And if we don't address the business needs, whether they're valid or not for your business people, if we don't address the business needs, employees will circumvent the policy because they believe that they're doing their job. And believe me, through the last 10 years, I have seen so many instances where employees feel like they're doing the right thing by keeping something forever, not realizing that in reality that the opposite may be true. So then the business people are going to identify, all right, what is the sensitive nature of the records and information that they work with? And this is critical to addressing underlying vulnerabilities to corporate proprietary information, customer data, employment data, and it will definitely impact where it should ultimately be stored and how it's protected. But we need to understand and answer these questions. So like I said before, there's software out there that can tell you very specifically where social security numbers or credit card numbers live within the organization, but oftentimes it's going to fail at finding things like intellectual property or, for instance, sensitive information that's defined by the European Union. So now you really have some insights and visibility that's critical in determining the different requirements that impact how you manage your records and how long you need to keep them. And we now understand the regulations that tell us when it's okay to get rid of our records. And it's okay to dispose of records that have met those regulatory requirements and obligations as long as they're not subject to a litigation hold. And what we've also found, it's usually much easier to get your arms around the retention requirements for your records than it is to really understand the business reference value that your business folks have for their information. So from the records inventory, once you've gathered that data, that information about your organization, you are going to have a much better, clearer understanding of your information, where it lives. And so companies are free to destroy information, and in fact, I don't think this is a news to anyone here today, you're encouraged to destroy information when there's no affirmative reason to keep it. And so this is a slide I'd really encourage you to pay some attention to, because this is what is going to enable you to take advantage of what James is going to talk about here in a few minutes. So the reality is that the value of most information that companies create drops off rapidly from the point that it's created. And so it has very little retention value. And business records actually make up a really small percentage of your overall information. And so you have to make sure that you account for those business records. And these are the records that have legitimate reasons for us to keep them, and whether they're regulatory reasons, legal reasons, or a business driver. And we also know an interesting statistic. We know that on average, only 20% of the records that companies retain have a regulatory requirement to keep them. Only 20%. So 80% of the information, on average, that your organization retains today doesn't have a regulatory requirement or a business requirement to retain. Some information has a reference value, but that really varies depending on the department that you're talking to. And some of the information at some point is going to be subject to a legal hold. And of course, we could obviously do an entire webcast on legal holds. But going through this process and getting a handle on your company's specific needs, this is that good faith effort that we're looking for to establish policies that legal and IT can put into action and address not only your records or your business records, but all information. So once we have a records inventory and an understanding of our business records, which, what records should we have on hold, which do we need to retain, which can be destroyed, it's time to talk about, all right, how do we implement this? Julie?
Thank you. So you've determined your legal hold needs, your regulatory retention needs, and your business needs. Finding what you need to retain in the various sources that you have is the next step, so that you can dispose of the rest. In my experience, much of what a company needs to keep for regulatory reasons has already been segregated by the responsible departments into specific systems or specific locations. And likely that's true for the business material that the business really feels it needs to keep for its corporate history. So it's worth looking at those and seeing if they're already satisfied, because that then simplifies the process of finding anything else that your company wants to retain and your legal hold retention, so that you can dispose of the rest. So ask what you already have in a segregated location, and then you'll be addressing the rest of your retention requirements. As a practical matter, I think the next step is to think about the data source by source, and remember they're active sources and they're legacy sources, and companies will prioritize those differently, but the basic principles of working through them are constant. And they're practical ways to work through a particular source of information. So Connor, would you take us through the practical side of that?
Sure. Well, I think you start off by looking at those information sources that you have sufficient information without delving into them in any fashion that allows you to determine there's no need to retain that information. It doesn't have a business requirement, not subject to a legal hold, there's no regulatory need to keep it. It could simply be that it's those boxes you were chatting about earlier, Juliet, that had the orange sticker on them. Destroy in 3 years. You know the 3 years have passed. You know it's 10 years down the road now. It's not subject to a legal hold. It's not subject to retention under the company's retention requirements. You can get rid of it. You don't need to dig any deeper there. With respect to the information about which you don't have sufficient information without doing some digging, the first place to start here really is the metadata. The file types may give you some guidance here. The dates on the files may give you some guidance here. The business unit to which the data relates may give you some information here. And there's technology available now that will actually help you derive information based upon the metadata that allows you to make these determinations without the need to actually dig into the information. And James, if you can talk a little bit about that technology, and then also how do we deal with the problem that we're facing with some sources of information where unless we start analyzing the contents, we can't really make a determination as to the need to retain.
Sure, Connor. Happy to. Well, so more and more there are tools and technology available that let you index the metadata on documents and then perform various analytics, so you can get a sense of who and what and when files were accessed, who modified them, how long ago they were modified. You can do deduplication and denisting and a variety of other types of analytics to make a determination of what is the information that I have, and then you can use that information to inform a decision to either dispose of the information, retain it because now you know that this is something that was important to your business, or come to a conclusion that you don't know yet and you need to do further analysis. So there are tools like Nuix Illuminate, a lot of the enterprise search technologies that are out there. Some of them are specialized for dealing with things like backup tapes or other media types. These tools kind of collectively give you the ability to do that level of analysis very effectively and very quickly. Oftentimes, you don't need to buy a tool. The other thing to consider when you're thinking about this problem for your business and specific data sources is that there are a lot of things that are built in to your IT infrastructure already. You have a variety of tools and technologies available to you that IT probably already has at their disposal that could inform this type of analysis. We did a project last year, in fact, where we were helping a company to conduct exactly this type of analysis, and they used a tool that they had implemented for data security that they already had in their arsenal, and didn't have to go out and buy specific technology to do this type of analysis. When you get down to content-based decisions, so now you're left with a body of documents where you're just not sure. You can't tell just because it's an Excel file that was accessed last year whether or not you need to keep it. You need to look inside the document, and for that you need to have technology that has the capability of examining the contents of the document itself. When you're considering those kinds of technologies, really what you're doing is you're talking about search tools in general, and tools that could search the content, index the content, or scan the content of the document to help you make a decision about whether or not to, about what the document is, based on, the linguistic characteristics of the document. When you're thinking about those kinds of tools, there's really, I think, three key things that you need to consider. One is, does the technology get you to the point where you're actually making a distinction between records and non-records? And, does the technology perform well in terms of the accuracy of its results? In other words, is it finding what you need without bringing back a bunch of stuff that you don't need? And then finally, what is the level of infrastructure investment required for that technology? And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But there's a huge variance in the amount of infrastructure that's required. I'll just say this, when you index a data population, oftentimes the index is the same size as the overall population. So when you're making content-based decisions, you're looking for linguistic characteristics. So in other words, you're searching for certain things in the document. And for there, you need to know what it is that you're looking for. And that's really the first order of business. And we've been talking about that all along. Both Connor and Robert talked about the need to, do the work with the company to understand what the record types that you have are, in order to translate those definitions of those record types into something that's really actionable by a product. It's, we feel that it's a requirement to take that definition down to a much more granular level of detail. We think that there's a science to this process that requires expertise in the tools. It requires expertise in the subject matter being searched, and it requires knowledge of the language that's in the documents themselves. You know, company by company, you'll see large variances in the way that people talk about the same things, and certain concepts are very, very difficult. You know, when you start talking about some of the more subtle record types, things like intellectual property or contracts, some of the language that would distinguish a contract from another contract or distinguish a contract from a different document, particularly when you start talking about things like agreements made in email, that language is very subtle. Getting back to the you know, once you have that definition in place and you have your tool there, and you start thinking about running searches to go and find that information, you need to really decide how you're going to measure success. Maybe we can just jump to the next slide. You know, the challenge here is to find what you need, measured as high recall, without the stuff that you don't need, measured as high precision. And you know, recall is a concept. Recall and precision are concepts that have been around in the space of information retrieval for as long as there have been search technologies. So, you know, dating back to the 60s. But, you know, if you think of recall as being the proportion of documents from the total number of relevant documents that are out there in the wild, the proportion that you actually found is recall. And then when you look at a result set of any search, you can say, well, what proportion of these documents are actually what I was looking for? And that's the precision. And the goal, you know, the real challenge here with this kind of a problem, where you want to do an exhaustive search and find all of the relevant documents and minimize the number of false positives, is to get both high recall and high precision. We'll jump to the next slide. It turns out that you know, these two metrics really kind of sit on opposite axes in this chart. You can get to, you know, high precision and high recall. That's the goal in the upper right-hand corner. The Text Retrieval Conference, TREC, is part of the National Institute of Standards. They've been measuring precision and recall, you know, going back the last 35 years. In 2008, they started a legal track where they were looking at the problem of this exhaustive search. In a legal context, some of you might know, if you're doing a responsive review or you're doing you know, a review for production of some kind, where you have an obligation to produce all of the responsive documents, it's this exhaustive search problem. And so a number of different vendors have participated in the studies that were hosted by TREC, and the results were all over the place. We just jump to the next slide. We just clicked. As you can see, you know, in 2008, 2009, 2010, by the different dots on here, you had vendors that were sitting up in the upper right-hand corner, performing well, high precision, high recall. But you also had, you know, vendors, products that were sitting way down in the lower left corner, and that's a little bit scary when you start out relying on technology to accurately identify the records that you need to retain, so that you can defensibly dispose of the records that you don't. You know, if you don't have comfort that you've retained everything you need to, you don't have any way of documenting that, etc., then, you know, you're left with the same problem you started with. Big investment, a lot of time spent. You've identified some records you need to retain, but not with enough comfort and enough, you know, enough security that you could actually, you know, then go and press the delete button, because you know that everything else is left behind. You can go to the next slide. So, so when you're automating, excuse me, when you're automating these content-based decisions, it's really important to select a technology that will perform well in terms of precision and recall. You know, at H5, we can use any combination of technologies. We have our own. We've worked with products such as Nuix. We've worked with products such as Autonomy to develop this measurement protocol around how your searches are performing, so that at the end of whatever your project is, when you're finally there and you're ready to press the delete button, you have the documentation, you have the paper trail that you need to be able to say, yeah, we found everything that we're supposed to find. Okay. Now, in terms of the measurement protocol itself, really the way that you do this, the way that you measure precision and recall is to do it using statistical sampling. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's important to note that, you don't have to go through this, you don't have to look at every document in order to make a judgment about how well your system is performing. You can look at a relatively small sample. I mean, a few thousand documents, even if you have millions of documents that you're reviewing, that you're analyzing, you can look at a few thousand documents to make a determination as to how well the system is performing in terms of precision and recall. So finally, it's important to consider your data landscape and the suitability of whatever tool and technology you're applying. We did some work with a client a few years ago, a financial services client, that was retaining all of their email. They have an SEC obligation to do so. And then they were using a search product to index all of the retained email. And it turned out that they ended up having to have over 100 physical servers to host the search to index this very, very large data population. And that the index itself was about 1.5 times the size of the data. And even with all of that infrastructure, it still took sometimes hours or days to run specific searches against the data population. So they've made a huge infrastructure investment in order to enable themselves to search for data. And at the end of it, the performance it wasn't really where they wanted it to be. So think about what you want to do. I liked what Julie had to say earlier about, let's look at things data source by data source. Let's make the decisions that we need to make on that data source specifically, and then be done with it and move on to the next data source, as opposed to trying to boil the ocean and deal with all of the data in your organization all at once. So just to recap, when you're selecting technology, does the technology get you to the point where you're actually distinguishing records from non-records? Does the technology perform well in terms of precision and recall? And finally, what level of infrastructure investment am I willing to make in order to solve this problem? And do I really have a good insight into what that's going to be? So move to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about H5 solutions. So let me just orient you on this document. You have your universe of data, and the goal is to segregate records from non-records. And when you have records, it may be important to your organization to really distinguish between different record types so that you can apply different retention schedules to them. You may or may not want to do that depending on what it is. If the goal is a legal hold problem and you want to identify everything that's on legal hold, you may not need to break the held data down into sub-issues or something like that. Whereas if you're dealing with your, in this example, your HR data, it may be important for you to distinguish between benefits documents and medical or payroll documents. The input to all of this for H5 is to start off with your records retention schedule and then work through a process, a fairly lightweight process with you and your organization, to translate that record retention schedule into a set of definitions of what it is that you need to keep. So what do you need to keep? We then take those and through an iterative development process, create the searches that will be run on our software or on your software to actually go and retrieve the information that you need to keep. And at every step of the way, we measure in terms of precision and recall how well those searches are performing individually and how well they're performing as a group. Our H5 Edge product is designed specifically to run these type of searches and move data from your legacy data source into a place where you're distinguishing your records from your non-records, or even making those more fine-grained distinctions to break it into the specific record types. Fairly straightforward to install and configure. It's lightweight. It doesn't index your data. So in other words, it's parsing it so the data is fed through the system like a pipe or a filter, and at the end of the work that the software is doing, you've actually distinguished between records and non-records.
So James, let's recap on QC, because when we consider defensibility, when we're using tools, we want to make sure that we know that we've found what we needed to retain. Robert, you might want to flip the slide forward. So you've talked about H5 doing that as it's designing searches. Broadly, what's the recap of that QC process?
Well, so the process is fairly straightforward. First you start off with a representative sample of information from the departments or the custodians or the data sources that you are planning to put through this process. And as you're developing the searches, you measure precision and recall using those samples. And the criteria for success is really this definition that we've created of what it is that you want to keep. We do that during development. We'll do that again when you deploy the searches into your environment and are actually running it against your live data. And then we might come back periodically and re-measure the precision and recall of the system, down the road, a year from now, 6 months from now, because your data changes and your business criteria change. We have one client where they acquired a couple of new entities. They're using our software, and they really needed to incorporate those new companies' information into the classification rules, into the searches that we built for them. And so we went through a process that we call a calibration process, where we took our existing body, our existing rules, ran it against the new company's information, against samples of it, found where there were discrepancies, and then simply updated the rules to incorporate the language that was present in the new company's documents.
Thank you. And a couple things that I've done with clients to help them get comfortable, because not every client is as tech savvy as the folks on the phone. Where sometimes, you all are dealing with people who are more old-fashioned perhaps in their approach. A couple things you can do. One is you can define your retention requirements when you're breaking them down into the content you need to keep. You can define them a little more broadly so that people feel like there's a comfort zone and that you're catching a little more than you need. That sometimes makes people feel comfortable. Another thing is doing an extra test at the end before you push the delete button, where you're sampling the garbage pile and you look through the sample, which, as James said, could be statistically significant and not that many documents, and confirm that yes, the sample is garbage, so the searches really worked, and now I can throw that away, but I could explain to a judge that not only did I run the technology that had been properly calibrated, but I checked. I did an extra check at the end before I pushed delete, and I've seen that make people quite comfortable. So let's turn to disposal, right? Because we found what we needed to keep, so now we can dispose of the rest. Connor, do you want to talk about how we make that disposal defensible from a security perspective?
Sure. As we all know, when I hit delete on my keyboard, nothing really disappears. All that's doing is letting the system know that information that was previously reserved for a particular file is now available should that space need to be overwritten. So simply deleting information isn't going to actually result in a secure disposal. And the measures that you're going to take will obviously vary depending upon the sensitivity of the information. It may vary from simple multiple overwrites of the media on which the information was residing to ensure that it has been sufficiently overwritten to prevent recalling or reconstructing or reconstituting that information, or if you are particularly concerned about the information, it's trade secrets, it's proprietary, it's PHI, it's PII, you may want to engage in actual physical destruction of the media itself, the hard drive, the thumb drive, the backup tapes, to ensure that it is completely and totally physically destroyed. But along the way, what is key here is you want to be making reasonable, rational, informed decisions that you are going to document should the need arise at some future point to defend the actions that were taken.
Right, and you and I both agree that you can't hand off or pass off this security risk or the privacy risk to a third-party disposal vendor. So if you're doing physical disposal, I would recommend that you do it on site or where your company folks are observing the disposal so that you really know that the media really went away. that risk doesn't pass off, does it?
No, I think that's very prudent because, like you indicated, you can't pass off the risk. Simply handing over the media doesn't mean that the risk transfers to the vendor you're using to dispose of the media. The information was entrusted to your organization. It's your responsibility to ensure that it is securely disposed of.
And my experience is that once you've worked with IT, you know, the lawyers, the IT, and the record managers work together over time, new ideas come up about how to, that IT has about how to structure the data infrastructure so that it becomes easier to dispose when it's time to dispose. Let's turn to the documentation. Robert, everyone's talked about that some. Do you want to take us through how you think about that process?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the question is, you know, how do we show that our deletion process is defensible? And in our opinion, I mean, you have to be able to show your work and support the logic behind the decisions that you've made and your ultimate policies. And basically, we're looking for how do we arrive at our answers. So if you think back for a minute to middle school algebra, and I know this may be painful for some, this will just take a second, but if you think about when you were trying to solve an algebra problem, you may have the right answer to a problem, but if you weren't able to show your work and how you got to that answer, you didn't get full credit. And if you had the wrong answer, but you showed some of your work, you might at least get partial credit for that question. So that's really the perfect analogy for what makes deletion defensible. So when you're asked, you know, why did you do it or how did you do it, if you can't demonstrate and explain how you arrived at your conclusions, your answer really is irrelevant. So you need to be able to show the process in which you created your retention schedule, you created your policies in your program. You know, how did you train employees? Showing the audit trails that demonstrate that your policies are communicated and adhered to by the business people. So, you know, judges will need to understand the practical reasons why you've deleted records and information, and you need to be able to point to this logical process that you went through and how you arrived at your decisions. And you know, you can't get there without going through this process to really first understand, all right, what records do we have? Where are they located? How does our business use them? You know, this is the showing of our work when we're asked, how did you create your records retention policy? James, can you talk a little bit just about showing your work from the technology perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, again, when you're using technology to be able to show the searches that you ran, and then have some justification for why you selected those searches, and really the best justification for that is the measurement of the accuracy of the searches in terms of precision or recall.
And that's something that we've assisted with from time to time if the question comes up. That documentation is something that your vendor ought to be creating with you. Let me take a minute, if I may, to recap the main points we've covered. Defensibility of deletion is really a retention issue, being sure to retain what you needed to keep, particularly for legal and regulatory purposes, so that you can dispose of the rest. So steps: determine your retention requirements, determine your data sources that need attention, assess those sources efficiently to find what you need to retain, using essentially the least deep dive possible to be able to justify that the information that you need to retain is not within those sources. And Connor and James took you through the layers of that. Some things you can address without opening the media at all, like legacy systems that are outside of your retention range. Some you can address at the document type or metadata level. Some require a deep analysis of content, which, given the volumes we're dealing with and the lack of time employees has, really requires automation in most cases, where you can methodically go through the data, searching for what you need to retain with high recall, so that you can retain that and know you can dispose of the rest. That requires expertise, and that expertise is a way to bring efficiency, speed, and actually reduced costs to the business. You need to have a valid QC process, and when you're talking about search, you're talking about a scientifically valid process. Then you need secure disposal of the data that doesn't need to be retained to protect yourself from privacy breaches. And you need to document your process as you go through, document your work, and document your disposal so that you know what went away at what point in time, using what method, and who observed it. Robert, back to you.
Great. Thanks, Julie. Well, that concludes the content of our webcast this afternoon, and unfortunately we've run out of time to answer some of the questions that we received, but I do see some of these questions, so we will follow up with you directly. I'd like to thank everyone who joined today. We appreciate you being here, and I'd like to thank my panelists, Julie, Connor, and James, and I hope you've learned something new about defensible deletion. And please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us on the panel if you have any additional questions. Thank you.